Invincible Iron Man. This film was released 1 year before the live-action Iron Man with Robert Downey Junior and Gwyneth Paltrow, so it's odd that they would do this, when all the hum would have been about the live-action version. This film attempts to tell the origin story in another retcon, but one closer to the original, where instead of being in Afghanistan, Tony Stark is in China, attempting to raise a temple. It actually makes some sense then that he would make such an enemy of the Mandarin. And then we don't have some disappointing rewrite with people using some powers like out of BioShock. I'm looking at you, Iron Man 3. This film was actually produced by Marvel and Lionsgate, which is fascinating as the opening credits are pretty compelling, a mixture of Asian flute, techno, and classical score, over scenes of industrial workings showing a completed Mark I Iron Man prototype. The film is hand-drawn animation, which is great, as I was expecting the mediocre animation we saw in Iron Man and Hulk Heroes United. Heroes United was as good as it sounds. The animation is stiff and mechanical for Hulk, making it look rushed, and the writing is sloppy, indicating that they had a basic idea of what they wanted to see, even if it didn't make sense and was just shoehorned in for spectacle instead of making it valid and congruent to the story. For Invincible Iron Man, we open upon an archaeological dig being supervised by Rhodey. And it's told without needing to show us that the dig is delayed by gang raids and threatened by the oncoming monsoon season. An explosion from the aforementioned gang, the Jade Dragons, firing personal rocket launchers at the cargo plane, leads Rhodey to call Stark to bring him to China for the dig. I do have to say that the animation in this is beautiful. From shots of Stark Tower in New York City to a boardroom with a stained glass window of Prometheus, Pepper Potts isn't made into Stark's immediate love interest, just his assistant. Howard Stark is alive and well in this, and we get a bit of Ayn Rand objectivist symbology in the same board scene where Stark is being cast out of Olympus for hubris. The Stark dig is using some interesting ideas to raise the temple to ground level, using sonic tools to inflate steel similarly to an inflating airbag, as it spins into a solid lightweight structure beneath the temple. It's a fascinating idea, and I'm really glad that it comes back later as a plot device. Stark is in an armored convoy like before, but it's not the U.S. military, just a private security force. They're detoured by a fuel truck and attacked by the Jade Dragons, who it is revealed are attacking to lure Tony Stark there. This writing is brilliant at this point. Rhodey is a civilian employee of Stark Enterprises, and when Tony is mortally wounded, first is outraged and then reveals that he is an army medic and sets himself to treating Tony's wounds. Again, I love this. It's a little plot convenient, but it's a better plot than the third live-action Iron Man film. This could have been the plot had they not written Howard Stark as dead. While the Jade Dragons hold Tony and Rhodey, elementals emerge from the temple's statues. Rhodey saves Tony's life, and with the help of a Zen monk/doctor, puts him in an apparatus to keep him alive. The elementals have to be stopped to prevent the Mandarin from returning, and the Jade Dragons want the city to be destroyed, meaning that Tony has to take out the steel columns underneath the temple. At this point, I'm confused whether it's a city or a temple, as they refer to it in both terms. But whatever, the Jade Dragons leader shoots the monk, not cool, and then threatens Rhodey, also not cool. So with Rhodey's help, Tony uses the special steel to begin construction of the Iron Man suit and figures out a way to soften the steel columns under the temple. Lee May, a sympathetic member of the Jade Dragons and the clear love interest for Tony. The Jade Dragons' leader, Mr. Chu, storms in to look at their work and finds that the device to soften the metal columns is a ruse, empty inside. Meanwhile, Tony starts up the Mark I, a much better-looking version, I'll add. He tries to take Lee May with him, but she won't come along. Lee May is not the senior member of the Jade Dragons, and a mural reveals a prophecy that the Mandarin will battle an Iron Knight, and that one of them will be defeated. Although it's a little Harry Potter, the plot point still makes it interesting enough. Upon landing back in the United States, Stark is arrested by S.H.I.E.L.D. for selling arms to the Jade Dragons, and upon seeing his father, makes a break for it with Tony in the car. And Rhodey there. When the Jade Dragons attack the temple to destroy it, the fifth elemental, a dragon, is already there, and Li Mei's men are defeated. She asks forgiveness because she feels all is lost. On the lam, it turns out that Rhodey is an engineer in this film, making him an even more intriguing character in my opinion. Tony notices that disturbances around the globe coincide with locations that the monk, Ho Yin, drew on a map to show where he could stop the elementals. He contacts Pepper, who uses a ruse to talk with Tony in privacy, and arranges a means for him to enter the building unnoticed. Pepper uses another ruse to get Tony and Rhodey into his office, and the S.H.I.E.L.D. agents down to the lobby. Tony tells Pepper to move some funds from an offshore account to be made available for his use. He then reveals a secret lab where he and Rhodey can work in secret, a room that even Pepper didn't know about. Already, by the end of Act 2, this film has better story than Iron Man, and I do not say that lightly because I loved the first live-action Iron Man film. So, we immediately reveal that the secret project mentioned in the boardroom scene was a whole host of exosuits, and Rhodey is pissed that he was kept in the dark about this. It turns out that Howard Stark took a lot of Tony's work and put it into the military division, and Rhodey accuses Tony of doing the same thing. But I don't really see it. Howard took Tony's inventions and put them into the military, where up to this point Tony hasn't seemed to have issues with military projects. It seems a bit contrived to have that plot point alluded to, but have it weakly tied in to Rhodey being upset about not knowing. So Tony says Rhodey is right and moves on to have them focus on stopping the elementals, making that dramatic character-focused scene rather pointless. It seems like it was just there to end the scene and add some conflict between the protagonist and his confidant. We then cut to the elementals taking a ring from another location, and remember, they have to get all 5 rings to resurrect the Mandarin. The aquatic Iron Man suit flies in, and I guess that we're to assume that this is Atlantis, except that Atlantis is supposed to be the realm of the Submariner, Prince Namor. Anyway, Tony defeats one of the elementals, but is trapped in the temple, buried under rock as the water comes back in. The suit springs a leak, but he manages to get out. In a much more realistic, dramatic point, Tony accepts that he was responsible for the elementals trying to resurrect the Mandarin by raising the temple. But in a stupid move, he doesn't continue his quest to stop them so that he can go have a fight with his father. Although the argument between them is compelling, it's brief and kind of pointless. It could have been done over the phone, really. We find out that Howard sent weapons to Rhodey to help the crew defend themselves, but Tony points out what he pointed out before. The weapons would be stolen and the Jade Dragons would just use them to attack the crew, just like they did. Howard brings up how his wife, Tony's mother, was anti-military, and we're told that she died, leaving Howard and Tony both heartbroken, although Howard still doesn't like hearing how he's seen as a merchant of death by his son. So Tony flies to a Central American volcano to stop the elementals from taking the ring. He's forced to use his chest cannon, but it doesn't really stop them. At this point, I'll point out that the suit and the elementals are all CGI, and it works in this film, even though the backgrounds are hand-drawn. I'll also point out that the setting of the film seems to be the early to mid-60s, judging by the look of the cars. And this makes sense, given the time of the original Iron Man comics debut. Stark defeats 2 more elementals by first having one stab the other with its spear, and then having the other melt away inside the lava, which is somehow transparent enough beneath the surface to see the elemental dissolve like milk in hot cocoa. The Earth Elemental is impossible to kill, but Tony makes it out and crashes in the jungle. He makes his way back to New York, where Li Mei is waiting to help him. He calls Howard, who acts uncharacteristic, to let Tony know to stay away as he sits surrounded by S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, despite speaking otherwise to look like he's cooperating. Given the setting of the height of the Cold War, it actually makes sense that the government would be so tenacious about an industrialist who was operating in communist China, and seeming to sell them weapons. That is an underplayed element of the story that's really quite clever, and I wish that they would mention it more. At the temple, it's revealed that it is guarded by clay warriors, just like the Meiji warriors. Without access to his other suits, Tony has to use the Mark I we saw earlier, which was stowed away aboard the airplane, which for some reason isn't being watched by S.H.I.E.L.D. agents. Stark says, "I have had enough of you," to the Earth Elemental in some reference to Star Trek III that makes no sense. But the Earth Elemental is defeated and Stark hands the rings over to Mei Lee. Actually, I think it's Lee May. Anyway. She puts the 4 rings on and reveals that she gave the Chinese government the documents that led them to think that he was selling weapons to the Jade Dragons, and that the 5th ring is her bracelet, even though that doesn't really make sense. It turns out that the reason why she feels so conflicted is because she is the last descendant of the Mandarin, which explains why her father was mad not to have a son, and that she has to be his vessel when he returns. So somehow the Clay Army takes down Iron Man with a volley of arrows. This is supposed to be the Invincible Iron Man? So while Tony battles the Terracotta Army, Li Mei goes to become the Mandarin, as the floor of the temple reveals a massive tomb filled with skeletons in the walls and skulls in the moat, surrounding the Mandarin's casket. She uses the rings to help the Mandarin rise from his tomb, while Tony battles a giant dragon, shoving a canister of the steel down its throat, and then using the sonic gun we saw earlier to fill the creature with that funky inflating steel. Li Mei is sapped of all her life force to bring the Mandarin back to life, as we see that the dragon is defeated. So she's fighting him naked as the Mandarin's ghost conveniently obscures her naughty bits. Tony tries to remind her of who she is as the Mandarin urges her on, and without fail the Mandarin uses Force Lightning on her. She starts to take the rings off, which weakens the Mandarin, until he goes back to dead. Li Mei lies, covered in filth, as Tony comes to her side as she dies in his arms. Cut back to New York and the boardroom. Tony has been cleared of all charges, and it turns out that the board has been bought out of controlling interest in Stark Industries, and naturally Tony is the one who did it. He makes Rhodey chief engineer, and Howard the head of the company. And the last gesture of Howard before closing the credits is to fire the board. I could actually have seen this as the start of a whole series. They bother to show images from different covers of Iron Man and some other Marvel characters. And to be honest, I think that although it had its moments lacking, Invincible Iron Man was actually a better overall film than the live-action version that came out a year later. It flows more like a comic book, and the art is more reflective of the current style of character design. It actually feels like a motion comic, only fully animated. The look and feel are rich and satisfying, like a labor of love. I don't often say this, but this is a better adaptation than the live-action, and I wish that they had pursued this rather than the live-action version, with more sequels, or done both concurrently. I've seen the recent TV series of Iron Man, and they lack a lot of what is here, and you have the groundwork for the Mandarin to still rise again. Invincible Iron Man gets a 4 out of 5.